Our Old Testament lesson for today comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, "Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, "Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out." Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." And God said, "Go and say to this people, keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears and shut their eyes, so they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed." Then I said, "How long, O Lord?" And he said, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Even if 1/10 part remain in it, it will be burned again like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump." Amen. As many of you know, we have a grandbaby named Elizabeth who was born back in July. I get almost daily pictures on my iPhone to see Elizabeth as she changes. And I think having grandchildren is one of those rewards that you get for surviving raising your own children. Now, one of the things I love most about all babies, not just my granddaughter, is the wide range of expressions they have as they're learning how to work their face and connect expressions to emotions. I especially like it when they're learning new things. The look of astonishment that babies so often have because the world is all so new. You know the look. Eyes as wide as they can be, mouth in a wide oval. Often you can even hear an audible gasp from them. And then the head jerks back and they almost fall. And they don't know if they should be scared and start crying, or if they're excited and start laughing. They are simply astonished and for a moment don't know what to do. Now often this look of astonishment comes when a baby has done something new, like when they pull themselves up standing and they suddenly see the world from a different height. They're astonished. They've managed to change the world. They have a sense of power over their surroundings. But other times, the look comes when they're surprised by something that someone else does. That's the whole fun of playing peekaboo. And I play peekaboo with babies in restaurants and everywhere I go. But you see surprise and joy, excitement, and yes, just a little bit of fear wrapped up in that one delightful expression. When something new is revealed to us, the natural response is to be astonished. Now, as we get older, it gets harder and harder to be astonished by anything. It also becomes less socially acceptable to let people know that you have been astounded. I'm often bemused by teenagers who are going through one of the most amazing periods of their lives. Their bodies are being transformed, they're making life-changing decisions, and they're learning such new and wonderful and exciting things, and they pretend to be bored. I look at old photos of me sometimes, and I look like I am this world-weary veteran who's wandered into Rick's Bar in Casablanca, or maybe a French philosopher suffering from ennui mixed with existential angst. Because it's uncool to be astonished. Thankfully, over the years, I grew out of that. And I can now openly embrace the joy of surprise, especially when I learn something new or encounter something unexpectedly beautiful. This comes to mind this week because all three of our biblical passages assigned for today involve people being astonished by God. Isaiah, the Apostle Paul, and Jesus' disciples in different ways all had experiences that rocked their world and left them changed. The three experiences are quite different. Paul lists all these appearances of Christ, and he is the last one. The disciples, it's when they're fishing. Isaiah is working in the temple as a priest. They're all doing ordinary things, routine things, when something happens. Paul was on his way to Damascus. The disciples were simply doing their jobs, but in the midst of the ordinary, the extraordinary happened. Another thing they all share in common is that they were all frightened by their experience and felt unworthy. They also all received a revelation or a new insight. Isaiah had a vision of God in heaven. Paul saw the resurrected Christ, and the disciples experienced that Jesus was more than a mere man. And each of them was given a task. If we had time this morning, we'd love to go into each of these in details, but I'll save two of them for future Sundays and focus today on Isaiah's vision in the temple when he saw the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, there's something I find beautiful about the simple way the Isaiah text begins. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne. It may sound like Isaiah is trying to give us a precise date as for this vision, that it happened in such and such a year, but unfortunately we don't know for sure when King Uzziah died. Ancient chronologies are difficult to work out. It was sometime between 742 and 736 BC, but we don't know when this actually happened, or even how long after the event that Isaiah wrote down his experience. What we do know is that Isaiah had his vision when the mighty Assyrian emperor Tiglath-Pileser III was at the height of his power. We know a lot about him because Assyria was the superpower in the Middle East, and the empire had a lot of records. There are many texts telling us about the exploits of Tiglath-Pileser. By the way, when I was in seminary, a friend of mine had a cat named Tig, not short for tiger, but short for Tiglath-Pileser. We were nerds in seminary. Now, the reason I think that Isaiah told us his vision came in the year that King Uzziah died is not for chronology. It's because it was so significant. King Uzziah reigned for over half a century in Jerusalem, and his death was a turning point in Jewish history. The Old Testament counts him as one of the great kings of Judah because he successfully resisted the Assyrians and kept the kingdom of Judah safe. He also followed the laws of Moses and listened to his prophets. So, 2 generations of Jews had come of age under the rule of King Uzziah. Many of them, that's the only king they had ever known. When Isaiah wrote, in the year that King Uzziah died, he wasn't talking about a date. He was talking about a time of crisis that everyone remembered. It's like Americans saying in the year that JFK was shot, instead of saying 1963. Millions of Americans today remember the grief and anxiety they felt when the president died. They remember the fear of another world war, imminent social collapse, and other threats. 1963 is a date. The year JFK died is a feeling. And the year that King Uzziah died means that Isaiah's version came at a time when the kingdom was at a crisis point. The defender of the realm who had promoted justice and kept the people safe had died. People were anxious. Would the new ruler follow the path of righteousness, justice, and peace of his predecessor? Or would he be an arrogant despot who pillaged his own people to reward cronies, who offended allies and enemies so that the kingdom was left divided and vulnerable? Would everything they had depended on be swept away because of a wicked ruler? Spoiler alert, the answer was yes. That is what happened after. People in Judea were anxious. But I'm sure that Isaiah was more anxious than most because he was a smart, well-informed, and engaged religious leader who served in the temple. He was probably an advisor to the king. Isaiah's job was to remind the king and the princes of Judah of their obligations to the people under the law of God. Isaiah was the one who had to remind the king that the Bible demands that his followers show mercy to strangers and sojourners, that God expected the king to unite the nation. King Uzziah had listened to the priests and prophets and followed the law. What would his successor do? What should the prophets do to help the nation? When Isaiah went into that temple, he was anxious. And it was in that time of anxiety that he received his calling and commission from God. So in our passage for this morning, Isaiah was performing his normal duties of presenting offerings to God in the temple and praying for divine assistance. I'm sure he had done this many times before, but I imagine he prayed a little more fervently that year. Just like a modern pastor, Isaiah said the proper prayers, sang the psalms for the day, made offerings the same way. He was in a sacred place where the incense was burned. But Isaiah didn't expect anything different to happen this time in the temple. He was following the routines of worshiping an invisible God just as we do Sunday after Sunday. Isaiah served God, but I doubt he ever expected to meet God. But in the year that King Uzziah died, something extraordinary happened. Isaiah had a vision of the God he worshiped. He describes it like a modern sci-fi or fantasy movie where a portal opens to a different dimension. He got to see beyond the veil of normal reality and glimpsed a wonderful world beyond. He saw the magnificent throne of God in the heavens, and the glory of God filled the temple. One thing that scholars of religion agree on is that religious visions like this use the symbols and images people are already familiar with. Kind of like in our dreams, have familiar things, but in an uncommon way. In Isaiah's case, he pictured God as a king on the throne, since he was familiar with kings sitting on thrones. But God's throne was more magnificent than the throne of Uzziah. But that's not all that Isaiah saw. He saw and heard the seraphim acting like the king's court. We usually call these heavenly figures angels, but seraphim were nothing like the cute little cherubs we see in Renaissance paintings. They were terrifying and bizarre. Each had 6 wings covering their face and their feet because humans could not look at them and their brilliance. Think how frightening and humbling it would be to meet such a creature, so unlike anything we've encountered before. Isaiah also felt the whole temple shake as the seraphim sang the triple holy, or the trisagion, with thundering voices. We sang the hymn, Holy, 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 beautifully here at Home Church, but even at our best, we cannot make the building shake on its foundations. But the voices of the seraphim shook the temple, and Isaiah trembled in astonishment. The power of heaven is stronger than any temple made by humans. And what do they sing? The whole earth is full of God's glory. The whole earth, every day, the whole earth is full of God's glory, and yet somehow we rarely notice it. The whole earth is full of God's glory, and yet somehow we go through our days without being astonished over and over. We rarely have to gasp for breath because we're overwhelmed by the beauty of creation around us. Sure, we might point out a nice sunset or a pretty flower, but we keep ourselves from being astonished. Most of the time, we walk through life unaware of the miracles around us, unaware of the glory, because we have our defenses up and our blinders on. Have you ever gazed into the deep blue of the sky and fallen into rapture? Maybe you have. I'll always remember being at the Grand Canyon one night with 2 of my daughters when they were young. Sarah looked into the expanse of the indigo sky with its thousands of stars and whispered, "I feel so small." That evening we got a whiff of the glory of God by staring into the heavens, but even we there did not see God's glory the way the prophet did. But that brief moment remains fixed in my mind. The seraphim shook Isaiah up. They overcame his ordinary blindness by singing to him about the glory of God. He was a priest, but he needed to learn that God's glory fills the earth. Any place can be a sacred place. Any moment can be an opportunity for revelation. The seraphim saying that the glory of God is not just in temples, churches, and shrines we humans erect. We may see it any place, any time. For Isaiah, that moment came when he was anxious over the death of King Uzziah. At that moment of crisis, God revealed his presence. And moments of crisis can become moments of enlightenment and clarity. So what did this priest and prophet of Israel do when he saw the throne of God and heard the seraphim sing? You might think he would be ready for this moment since he was a priest. He was a professional religious person. You might think he would be happy to finally see the invisible God he worshiped and say, "Welcome to my temple." Instead, he cried out in fear. He knew the Bible, knew the rituals, knew the sacrifices, knew the ablutions and absolutions, knew all the formulas of proper worship, but was still unprepared for this experience. But let's not be too hard on him. What if that happened here on a Sunday at Home Church? What if our worship opened us up to a vision of true glory and the splendor of God? Isaiah was overwhelmed just as we would be, astonished in the fullest sense of the word. Like the baby that discovers something new, wonderful, and frightening, Isaiah cried out, "I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips." But then a seraph took a coal from the brazier that was burning incense in the temple, touched Isaiah's lips with the burning coal. Readers often get upset over this action since that would do serious damage to your lips. But remember, this is a vision, not reality. This is symbolism. The coal was a way to convince Isaiah that he was indeed worthy to stand before God and listen to God's command. Isaiah had been chosen and now was purified. He could listen to what God was telling him to do and say. In my studies, I've read several books written by mystics, and one thing I've learned is that mystics use a lot of words to try to explain something they confess is beyond words or even our ability to understand. It's hard to tell someone what it is like to have your mind blown and your world changed. But people, including some of the mystics, often focus too much on the experience itself. They want to be thrilled by the supernatural, like people love to have an adrenaline rush on roller coasters. The experience of astonishment is wonderful, just like the astonishment we experience in other ways. Getting a vision of a deeper reality can be frightening and beautiful, but what comes next is what is more important. God did not display his glory to Isaiah for Isaiah's amusement or to prove God's existence. God had a mission. Isaiah could not stay in the temple, basking in the glory of God. He was chosen for a task. God asked, "Whom shall I send?" And Isaiah gave the famous reply, "Send me." Last week in worship, we sang a hymn about this. God asked, "Whom shall I send?" Send me. Without asking what he would have to do, without seeing a job description or signing a waiver, Isaiah accepted his mission. God sent him into the world to speak for God. Isaiah was called to be a prophet who speaks truth to power and promotes justice and peace for the kingdom. As we heard in the last part of the text, it was not a pleasant message of encouragement, but one of judgment. Another time, we can dig into that more fully. But this morning, in this year 2025, I want to draw our attention to the power of astonishment to lead us into revelation, which in turn calls us to speak up. In this year 2025, perhaps some of us will see the glory of God and hear the voice of the seraphs and hear God asking, "Whom shall I send?" With fear and trembling, what will our answer be? Amen.